Oh,
All
okay.
right, welcome back, everybody. We are starting session 3 called Practical Matters, and we get to begin this session with a talk by Ms. Sydney A. Pickens, who tells your story, amplifying ancient Nubian perspectives. If anybody has a question for Sydney, either throughout the talk or at the end, please type your question into the Q&A function, and I will read it out for her at the end.
Sounds good. Thank you, Sarah. Good noon, good people. As Sarah said, my name is Sydney Alexandria Pickens. And today, I am an archaeology educator and curriculum writer with Archaeology in the Community, which is a DC-based nonprofit that focuses on archaeology education through informal, hands-on workshops and training. And during the pandemic, we also started to really lean into curriculum development. And that's how we got to the topic that I'm going to be talking about you all today. Umbrellaed under this idea of who tells your story, amplifying ancient Nubian perspectives. So we're just going to jump right in and get it going. Okay, there we go. So in order to foreground you all in this talk today, I'm going to just talk to you first about ancient Nubia, Pre-Kerma to the Kingdoms of Kush, which is a curricular unit created by Archaeology in the Community in partnership with the American Society of Overseas Research in about 2021. You'll see the videos that we have that are a part of this curriculum. They are two about 15, 20-minute long educational videos that give students a really comprehensive and background history into ancient Nubian history. What's really great about these videos is that they are pulling directly from scholarship of current and upcoming Nubian Studies scholars, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more in our next slide. But right now, I really want to focus in on the need for these resources and why AITC and ASOR came together to create them. So in conversations, found that there is a dearth of resources for teachers and students about ancient African history in particular. And so thinking about our fields and what we do as archaeologists, Egyptologists, and ASOR, which particularly looks at the ancient world around the Mediterranean, like how can we explore ancient African history? And we wanted to highlight ancient Nubia because of its lack thereof in our current education system, where we learn so much about ancient Egypt, which is amazing, but this just as powerful global power, formidable culture and kingdom that existed also along the Nile Valley from about 3500 BCE all the way through 300 CE, had this continuous thriving culture we don't hear so much about. And so we wanted to give students an opportunity to dive deeply into this culture, as well as to, again, bridge that gap between academic scholarship that's happening now and what's happening in our current school systems. We did really great work to try to make sure that we're incorporating all of the social studies standards while developing these resources. So the content covers geography, historical thinking, civics, as well as economics. And we add on a little extra that I like to call, I forgot the word, identity construction and cultural expression. And the work that we created is really grounded further into this idea of culturally sustaining pedagogy, which is a really phenomenal book that I recommend any educator interested in educational justice. It is a book written by H. Samuel Lean, who is a professor out of UCLA. He's a linguistic anthropologist, and Django Paris, who is I believe, a professor of education at the University of Washington currently. And what is culturally sustaining pedagogy? It exists wherever education sustains the lifeways of communities who have been and continue to be damaged and erased through schooling. We get that as an intro from our very first page in this book. So from that, we already know that we're going to have some good stuff coming out of there. It is a response that interrupts schools. That interrupts schools as a function of the colonial assimilationist project, and as a pedagogy centered on the linguistic, literate, and cultural pathways of BIPOC communities. So while creating this resource, we're really thinking heavily about how do we create something that is going to support the identity construction and thought processes behind Black and Brown students who, from my own experience in schools, when we learn about Black history, is oftentimes really situated in enslavement. And so moving away from that and moving towards these cultures of power, towards these histories of greatness, and really reframing the way we think about, again, the ancient African past. Oh, and Dr. Thumb earlier today in her opening of this conference or symposium talked about course correcting. And that is the lens through which I think about developing this curriculum, thinking about how we're telling the stories, and all the things that I'm talking about today. And so in addition to this, the way we're thinking about course correcting, I think about representation. And when we talk about who tells your story, it's not only the ancient Nubian perspectives that we're really interested in exploring. Yes, that's very important, but we're also curious about who is the one that is doing that interpretation. Who are the women, in this case, the Black women in Nubian Studies who are presenting this information to students, and giving students who otherwise don't have the opportunity to engage with this material, to see themselves as history makers, as cultural producers. And so we really wanted to ground this in this work of these Black women in Nubian studies. We have Dr. Solange Ashby, who is an Egyptologist at UCLA. She's a professor there. Deborah Hurd, who is a PhD candidate out of the University of Chicago. Janelle Marshall, who is a bioarchaeologist at, I believe, Purdue University. Yes. And Shayla Monroe, who is a zooarchaeologist who just recently got an appointment at Harvard. So all of these women are doing phenomenal things within the realm of Nubian studies. And what was really great about working with them was that we got to get a very specific, specialized approach to ancient Nubian history through their work. And so for Dr. Ashby, she provided really a linguistic and spiritual lens into ancient Nubian history. So she explores really Nubian religion and also trying to understand the Meroitic language, which I'll talk about in a bit. Deborah Herb gives students a really comprehensive background history from, again, that Pre-Kerma period. Actually, prior to that, she even takes us back to the Green Sahara over 1,000 years ago, and talks about the migrations to the those early migrations to the Nile Valley, and really contextualizes students in the geography and the deep history of Nubia from those earliest kingdoms of Kerma all the way down to the Meroitic period. Janelle Marshall in the video, she provides this bioarchaeological lens, which really looks deeply into ancient Nubian burial practices. So looking at the indigenous burial practice that they have, as well as how later during the Napatan period, they start to appropriate Egyptian burial practices in order to legitimize their rule once they take over Egypt during this about 75-year period. And then we have Shayla Monroe again, who her lens is as a zooarchaeologist. She talks about ancient Nubian economies based in this cattle culture, and how the entirety of ancient Nubian burial practices, their adornment and dress, and their foodways are all based around this cattle culture. And so again, we have these really phenomenal scholars telling students these really deep histories, and making it something exciting and new for them to learn. Oh, and I didn't mention that the lessons in particular are for middle and high school grade students, particularly the 6th grade, because across the nation, pretty standard is to have around 6th grade a world history or ancient civilizations course. And then when you get to about 9th or 10th grade, there is also, again, that world history and geography course that can be ancient and or more modern. So all of that is our background, which is, I know, a lot of background, to dive in now specifically into Who Tells Your Story. And Who Tells Your Story is the final lesson plan within the entirety of this curriculum. And I haven't spoken about the rest of the curriculum today, but please check it out. I have a QR code so you can look at the rest of it later on. And I also have done other talks on those other lessons, but because of time, I really just want to zero in on who tells your story because of the themes of today. So for this final lesson, we're looking at how does perspective shape your understanding of historical events, and how do motivations for writing influence the presentation of historical narratives. And I forget who asked me, like in our pre-call, I think it was maybe Kathleen, forgive me if I'm wrong, but they asked if this is a reference to Hamilton, and the answer is absolutely. So if you all are familiar with the hit Broadway musical Hamilton, they have a song that goes, it's titled Who Lives, Who Dies, Who Tells Your Story? And I wanted to pull in that title as kind of like a pop cultural reference to one grad student's attention, something that could connect to in a current way and get them excited to to figure, and also have a little bit of an idea of what the lesson material is going to be about. This lesson in particular takes a look at several different primary resources about ancient Nubia that are either by or about them. So you have about half from the ancient Nubian perspective, and then you have about half from either Egyptian, Roman, Greek, or Christian sources. What's interesting about the study of ancient Nubia is that this is an oral society, which it is absolutely amazing, what you see often in a lot of African cultures. And historically, these kind of cultures have been undermined because of that, because of the lack of textual sources. And what we were trying to do in this lesson is to really disrupt that narrative that because there's no written text prior to the Napatan period revival of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs in about 750 BCE. We want to lean into archaeology and the actual material culture that ancient Nubians have left behind for them to be able to use, for scholars now to be able to really, what's the word I want to use? Interpret and unlock ancient Nubian history, as opposed to relying solely on these, again, Egyptian, Greek, Roman materials, which have, again, historically been defamatory in nature, have looked at these societies in not the best lights. And so leaning further into the archaeological record to disrupt that narrative. Oh, and I also want to point out that particularly for this lesson, while the rest of the curriculum is attended for about 6th grade, this lesson in particular is relegated for those high school students because of the resources that we provide to students are higher level and have a higher reading level. And so I want to make sure that they are prepared and are properly equipped in order to actually do the deep analysis and interpretation of this work. Thank you, Kathleen. That was Kathleen. I thought so. Okay, please, everyone, feel free to click on, or not click on, but use your phones if you have them, if they're accessible, on this QR code. So one of the pieces of literature that we introduced to the students is Strabo's geography. The Greek historian and geographer, Strabo, he published his best-known work, Geographical or Geography, around 7 BCE. This work is 17 books. It presents a descriptive history of several world regions and provided a physical, political, historical details. And in book 17, which you have the link to or expert about book 17, this excerpt talks about the Meroitic Roman War. And so we provide students with this resource and start to ask them, what language is being used to describe the ancient Nubians? What perspectives are present? What perspectives are omitted? How do you, as a reader, are you interpreting the ancient Nubian past based on Strabo's account? I'm going to ask you all to engage with me a little bit, pretty please. If it wouldn't be too much trouble, please read over what you see in this document, and then throw in the chat any language that you see that stands out to you in particular about, what do you call it? Specifically about how he represents ancient Nubians. Feel free to throw anything in the chat. I'm not saying anything, I'm just going to keep pushing forward. So a couple of things that I pulled from Strabo's work is the Ethiopians emboldened, attacked the inhabitants, and also okay, I got one. Thank you, Candace. Emboldened, attacked, and enslaved the inhabitants and pulled down the statues of Caesar. Petronius. I saw someone. Oh yes, I got another one that says attacked. Candace was masculine, and even also we'll talk about this name Queen Candace in itself. Talking about 800 cavalry and a couple of infantrymen versus 30,000. Versus 30,000. They were badly marshaled and badly armed. And then on the inverse of that, we give students Strabo and fugitives, thank you. Then we give students, we have the language of violence here, as well as the language Greek is not Egyptian. And then we give students the Merowe head. Feel free to click on this QR code as well, which will take you to the British Museum's description of this head. And essentially, this Merowe head was found beneath the steps of a temple for victory in Merowe. And this work that I'm talking about right now directly pulls from the work of Dr. Solange Ashby, who has mentioned these things in her research. And what we've done for the curriculum is to actually pull directly from her work and be a conduit for students to be able to engage with these resources and just outline questions for them and think critically about what these things mean. And so when we think about archaeology, like how it's disrupting this idea that, well, yes, Strabo, he's giving us he provides a history of this war, but then we have the archaeological record that provides us a little bit of a different narrative. In Strabo's account, he mentions that all of the statues that the ancient Nubians went and tore down of Augustus Caesar, that they were all returned later on. But then again, we find them under this Temple of Victory. So that's in direct contradiction to Strabo's account. Or we think about current context when people are pulling down Confederate statues or these colonial occupiers, because these statues of Augustus were placed in Egyptian and Nubian lands. And so it's these people who are pushing back specifically against this colonial occupation. And then after that, we ask students to start thinking, to be creative in their own imaginations. And we give them a blank canvas, we give them a staircase and say, under this staircase, what are you trampling? What are the things that you are overcoming? What are the things that have oppressed you in your past, and how are you moving beyond these things? And so again, giving them students opportunity to really envision themselves as history makers, to think critically about how the past connects to their present and to their own experiences as students and as active learners. Have running low on time, so I won't get too deep into this, but then this is the Temple of Apetameka, which further again pushes on this idea of archaeology as a tool to disrupt this textual hegemony, and looking at archaeology as a means to really support the study and interpretation of oral societies and cultures. Here we have Queen Amanitore and King Natakamani smiting their enemies in this very traditional smiting scene that we see throughout ancient Egypt from as early as the first dynasty and during the Old Kingdom. And so now we have these Meroitic queens and kings appropriating the scene and then flipping it on its head. And you also might notice that while Strabo talks about the queens looking masculine, you can clearly tell that this is a very, as Dr. Ashby will say, a very voluptuous woman. They're presenting themselves here as both feminine and strong, and equal counterparts to the men that they are ruling with during this time, as well as beneath the feet. Again, you have them trampling these Roman soldiers. these Roman captives. And then lastly, again, we give students an opportunity to tell their own stories. And so thinking about how can they draw themselves into this history? How can they re-envision this same scene with their own selves as the subjects? And really think deeply about what are the things they are overcoming, how are they retelling their own stories, how are they being the vessels through which that their histories are being told and shared. And with that, that is my time. So thank you. Here is a link to, or a QR code to the full curriculum on AITC's website. I would recommend definitely using this one because we've updated it since. But yes, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sydney. That was a fascinating talk, and it's so important to be bringing Nubia back into the forefront of all of these conversations. And I especially love your example of the Epidemic Temple, as that's one of my personal favorites of the area. So I'm going to give people a moment to put their questions into the Q&A. But we're getting a lot of fantastic. Thank you so much. This was so important. So people are truly appreciating all of the work that you're putting into everything. Let's see here.
Thank you, everyone.
While we're waiting for, of course. Sorry.
Oh, I just re-put the last slide up just in case people didn't get it and they want to get hold of the resource.
Wonderful, thank you. While we're waiting for a couple of questions, could you share maybe an example of what some students put on the pylons of the Epidemic Temple?
Yeah, unfortunately, I haven't gotten to the point where I'm actually the one facilitating these resources. I just created them. So we've been able to kind of gauge just how they've been used. Like looking at the videos, there have been, for some of them, over 20,000 views, which I think is so exciting. But me, as an educator myself, hasn't been the one to implement them. So I always put my email at the bottom of my presentations here, particularly so if there are educators on the call who are implementing these resources in their classrooms, please do reach out. We would love to see how students are envisioning themselves again as these history makers and how they are supporting you in your own classrooms. I'm open to any feedback, critiques. I like to think of it as a living, breathing document. I go back every so in a while and I'm like, I'm editing it. Can someone please put a new version online for me, please? So I'm very open to thoughts, ideas, things like that.
Yeah.
Oh, and also like any education. Okay.
No, please. Any educators?
Oh, also for educators as well. I'm like also happy to do teacher workshops and teacher trainings and stuff in order to help ground them further into the work to be able to support them as they introduce these curriculums into their classrooms.
Wonderful. So Kathleen, unfortunately, she couldn't type into the Q&A because she's a host. And she has a comment: the parallel of men calling powerful women masculine from Strabo to today is just wild.
I'm so sorry. I was reading things and didn't
oh, that's okay. Kathleen made a comment about the parallel of men calling powerful women masculine from Strabo to today is wild.
It's why, and it's something that has been so deeply embedded in the culture that is something that needs to be unlearned. And when you're able to like call it out and actually see exactly like what are those motivations for why you're saying that? Is it because there's intimidation there? Is it because actually, like you said, she's just a powerful woman and is really exercising that power, and that seems to be unlike a woman, and so quote unquote unlike a woman. And so thinking about what does femininity look like and how are all the ways that those femininity does appear in the world, and particularly in this context in the ancient world, because Strabo is coming from this very Greek context where Greek women didn't have as much power as Egyptian and Nubian women had. And so when he would see that, there was just like, oh, this is completely outrageous. And so then having to kind of attribute to like masculine behavior, but actually women in ancient Nubia were super powerful. They were soul ruling queens, things like that. So
absolutely. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. One of the questions that we didn't get to in the Q&A, I will send to you personally so you can see it.
Okay.
but it's dealing with the current crisis in North Sudan,
I
of
see.
course.
Can I answer
Um,
really
but
fast?
Unfortunately, we're right at time, so
Okay.
unfortunately we can't. But thank you so much for this incredibly important presentation. We all enjoyed it tremendously.
Yes, thank you all for having me. Do I need to-
And just let you finish sharing your screen.